Good evening. Special welcome to all the members of the Habura, and nice to see some of you in person. So some of you might be following the book of Bereshit, the classes on Bereshit on YouTube. And we are going to be studying today the fifth day of Bereshit. But a question that came up last week, and I spoke about the stars and the celestial luminaries, and some people, and I also, I guess I spoke about astrology, and I pointed out that astrology is of no significance in Judaism, meaning stars, constellations, the shapes of the stars, or the configurations of the stars in the sky have no significance. And we, as I said, en mazal Israel. So some people pointed out that, somebody sent me, for example, a picture of a synagogue which had pictures of constellations, decorations on the synagogue of the various constellations. Somebody pointed out that the Zohar mentions it, the Gemara mentions it, and that's all true. Thank you. What you have to understand is that the astrological configurations, those constellations, they were a way to measure time. They were a way to measure the calendar, right? So nobody's denying that if you look up at the sky during different seasons of the year, you can tell what season it is based upon the constellations that you're looking at. I mean, that's an empirical fact. So yeah, you'll see the Gemara mentions various constellations, and when we measure the equinox, the spring equinox, the Kufat Nisan, we measure it based upon when the sun enters a particular constellation. So that's correct. Those are empirical facts. The question is not whether we observe constellations in the sky, but rather the question is whether those constellations have any significance. And as I pointed out last week, the answer is very simple. No, they don't. Judaism believes that everybody has free will, and that God measures us according to our actions, and that our actions depend on ourselves. And ultimately, our actions also, they're what determines a lot of what happens to us. Right? So the Gemara in Masechet Makot says, "B'derech she'adam holech b'molichim oto." In the path that a person chooses to travel, that's a path they'll put him on. So we believe that astrology is of no importance whatsoever. Right? It's not that there's like a little and, no, it's just I'm following the perspective of Harambam. And again, I know that there were Chachamim who believed in astrology. There were many Chachamim who perhaps believed that the earth was at the center of the universe and that the sun orbits around the earth. It's a scientific argument, right? So let's say today we believe in some scientific principle, and a particular Chacham expresses that scientific principle, and then later on it's shown that that scientific principle is incorrect. We're not going to hold it against the Chacham. It's just, it's science, and science changes, and ideas change, and as ideas change, we know more. So, for example, Harambam says a lot about science in his Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, and he paints a particular picture of the universe, and frankly, we have a much more precise picture of the universe than the picture painted by Harambam in Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah. Nothing embarrassing about it. If I was to write a book, it could be that 1,000 years from now, the book I write where I mention science may be further from the truth than what Harambam wrote, right? So it's not chas v'shalom, an insult against anybody. It's just, this is part of the progress of humanity. When it comes to science, we learn a lot. Torah, we say le'olam Adonai devarcha nisra b'shamayim. The Torah is eternal. It's the Torah we receive from Moshe Rabbeinu never changes. The mitzvot we receive never change. That's eternal. That comes from God. But science, men develop science. Man studies. Man learns new things, and that's there's a famous passage of Rambam where I think it's in Igeret Teman, where he discusses the Jewish people in Egypt and what a terrible state they were in, and how oppressed they were as slaves, and the situation seemed so hopeless. And Rambam writes that according to the stars, the Jewish people were at the lowest point. So in Egypt they believe in astrology, and the stars show that the Jewish people, it's over. There's nothing for them to do. And at the same time, the stars also show that Egypt was a rising power. So if you're a Jew in Egypt, you're like, what's going to happen? We're stuck here. right? And of course, it just wasn't true, right? So that's, and my father once told me something interesting. You may have noticed, some of you may have noticed, that Rambam never mentions the Avraham ben Ezra, right? You ever notice? He doesn't. He doesn't mention Rabbi Avraham ben Ezra. By the way, the son of Harambam, Rabbi Avraham ben Harambam, in his Perush on the Chumash mentions Rabbi Avraham ben Ezra. But Harambam doesn't mention a word about him. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, she'hakol nihiya bidvaro. Thank you. So he doesn't mention a word about So my father speculates that because Rabbi Avraham ben Ezra took a favorable perspective on astrology, and Rambam was so anti-astrology that he didn't even want to mention him, right? And Rambam's son was like a little more, daddy, like, come on, he's a great Chacham, mention, so he mentions him. But nevertheless, I thought I would share that with you. So I think my perspective is clear, Rambam's perspective is clear. I think science is clear also. So it's just empirical. Science has changed. So the same way we don't believe the earth is at the center of the world and it's not an emotional issue, I think saying that astrology is of no consequence shouldn't be an emotional issue for anyone. It's just empirical data. So that's what I wanted to say about last week. Last week was the creation of the luminaries. And this week I want to read to you the Pesukim on the 5th day of creation, Yom Hamishi. And I want to point out something. So the way that this works is there's a ma'amar, there's a statement of God. So the statement of God, in a sense, is the idea. It's the concept, right? So you have the concept of what's going to happen. Like, for example, Vayomer Elohim Yehi Or. That's the idea, right? And then what happens? Vayi Or. There was light. So there is the idea, there is the scientific principle, there is the guiding direction that's going to be taking place. But then there is the implementation. There is the execution of the idea. So keep that in mind. When you study the days of creation, you need to compare those two things. Because oftentimes there's a slight, I don't want to use the word dissonance. It's not really dissonance. But there's a slightly different iteration of what's happening or what's being thought, right? And when you see that, you can learn certain things. So I'm pointing that out now because we'll see it now in the 5th day. So I'm going to read the pasuk. And what I do in this thing, I'm going to read the pasuk. I'm going to explain the peshat of the pasukim. After explaining the peshat, very superficial, I will repeat it and go into it more deeply. Vayomer Elohim Yishresu Hamayim Sheres Nefesh Haya. So this is the idea. This is the concept. Let the waters bring forth a sheres. We'll explain in a moment what the sheres is. Nefesh. I'll explain what the word nefesh is. Haya. So a living thing, which is a sheres, and which is a nefesh. Ve'of yofef al ares. And let there also be these of, milashon la'uf, it's a verb. La'uf means to fly. So birds are those things which fly. Al penei rekiya hashamayim, let them fly up in the sky. So he's going to be creating these life forms that somehow inhabit the water. And then there's going to be another type of life form that inhabits the sky. So that's Vayomer. And then the pasuk says, Vayivra Elohim. And God created. What is the word Vayivra? For example, in the other days of creation, you don't have the word bara. You have the word bara where? Bereshit bara. Okay, Bereshit bara Elohim. Here, you have the word in the implementation of the idea. You have Vayivra Elohim. It says bara. We'll explain. So Vayivra Elohim tatanim gedolim, these great gedolim doesn't mean great in the sense of historical greatness, but rather large in size. Ve'et kol nefesh ha'haya haromeset asher sharesu hamayim leminahem. Here's the implementation. This nefesh chaya, haromeset asher sharesu hamayim. So he created these creatures that live in the oceans. Ve'et kol of kanaf lemineu. He created these creatures that fly and that have wings. Vayad Elohim kitov. That's the end of the day. There's another pasuk. We'll look at the pasuk later. But I want to go into this a little more deeply. Let's look at the characteristic of this life form that will inhabit the oceans. It's called nefesh haya. What does nefesh mean first? So let's start with the word nefesh. So we say on Shabbat, we say Shabbat vayinafash, right? We say Shabbat vayinafash. What does it mean Shabbat vayinafash? So when you inhale, that's ninshom, that's neshama. When you exhale, vayinafash, right? So nefesh are creatures that require oxygen to live, right? They're breathing creatures, right? So if you look at the different life forms on Earth, including the fish, which is what we're talking about now is fish, they all require oxygen to live. So that's nefesh. So nefesh is a common thread that unites all life forms, but not every single one, but the life forms that we're talking about now, and I will explain to you which are excluded, and you'll see the connection in the Pesukim between the life forms that are excluded from the idea of nefesh and the life forms that are included. But for now, nefesh chaya haromeset yishlesu hamayim sheres nefesh chaya. What does sheres mean? I take the Perush of Haramban with the Nun. There's, of course, Harambam, as you know, Rabbi Moshe Bar Maimon. And there was, from northern Spain, from the area of Catalonia, there was Haramban with the Nun. He says something that my father taught me, and I think it's correct. Sheres milashon larus. What does ratz mean? Ratz means to run, right? So what is a sheres? A sheres is a life form that has mobility, right? Because on the third day, we created the plants, we created the trees, vegetation. Vegetation doesn't have mobility. So now there's going to be something new in the world. There's going to be life forms that have this mobility. So that's sheres. You understand the word sheres? Sheras, right? Sheras, that runs or that has the ability to move. So it's going to characterize all these life forms of two things. On the one hand, it's a sheres, and on the other hand, it's a nefesh. It breathes, it moves, and it requires oxygen. Okay, let's continue. We're going to go back to this a little more. And where does all this start? It says Yishresu Hamayim. It all starts in the water. Today, scientists are always looking for life on other planets. They're always, aiming their telescopes and they want to see if they can detect life on other planets. And today, of course, we know that as a scientific matter, if you want to detect life on another planet, what are you going to look for on that other planet? What's the first thing you're going to look for? And if you see it, you say, wow, we think we've discovered it. It's a eureka moment. What are you going to look for when you want to find a planet which has life? Water. Exactly, water. Because if you have water, then you can have life. If you don't have water, you can't have life. So interesting. So the Torah says that the beginning of life, Yishresu hamayim. You see that? That's the beginning. You need to have water. So it all starts from the water. Yishresu hamayim, sheres nefesh chaya. Okay, now, I want to ask this question, and I want you to think about it. So we have the world without life. There's no life forms. You have the water. And then you have the world with life, and you have the life forms that come from the water. And we agree with science that life starts in the water. So on that, science and the Torah agree. There's a lot of things that science and the Torah agree on. There's many things that science and the Torah disagree on. But on that point, there's agreement. But the question is as follows. How did life originate? Where did it come from? In a moment, we're going to see what the Torah says. The Torah is a very clear, precise answer to the question. How did life originate? We'll see that in a moment. But first I want to read to you, and I believe what I'm reading now is from Berkeley University. Pretty sure it's from that. So here it is. How did life originate? That's a question that they ask, and I'm going to read it for you. Living things are enormously complex, and that's a problem that scientists are dealing with, right? They really are complex, and if they're complex, where did they come from? So here's the explanation. All this complexity did not leap fully formed from the primordial soup. So what they're saying is that even though life is very complex, it didn't just come suddenly. Rather, Instead, life almost certainly originated in a series of small steps, each building upon the complexity that evolved previously. So you have a simple system, and then that simple system transforms into a more complex system, but not very complex, and then it becomes more complex, and after these baby steps, you have this complex thing called life. I'm reading to you what they say. I'm trying not to snicker as I'm saying it, so please forgive me if I have a slight smile on my face. Simple organic molecules were formed. Again, I'm reading what they say. Simple organic molecules similar to the nucleotide shown below, and they have a diagram of a very complex molecule, are the building blocks of life and must have been involved in its origin. Experiments suggest that organic molecules could have been synthesized in the atmosphere of early Earth and rained down into the ocean. So it could have been, they're saying, where do these nucleotides come from? They're very complex molecules, so they came somehow with the rain. It rained down on the Earth. RNA and DNA molecules, the genetic material for all life, are just long chains of simple nucleotides. So, and then they continue, and they say these nucleotides eventually change into RNA molecules, into DNA molecules. Replicating molecules evolved and began to undergo natural selection. All living things reproduce, copying their genetic material and passing it on to their offspring. So here's a chain. The article goes on, and it describes, kind of, I guess, what I would call a step-by-step approach, right? Okay, that's all I wanted to read to you now. So what they're saying is that a series of random processes somehow took a simple thing and made it more complex, and then more random processes took that more complex thing and made it more complex, and eventually you had nucleotides, and eventually the nucleotides turned to RNA and DNA, and eventually you had life forms. Okay. And I know many of you would think this is not fair. I get it. But I can't help myself. Because there's a certain lack of rigor in that type of explanation. And I want to say the following. I'm okay with the theory of evolution at the theological level. It doesn't bother me, meaning as a person who studies Torah, if God chose to create the world through the theory of evolution, it doesn't bother me. The same way, if God chose to put the theory of relativity as one of the systems through which objects move in space, general theory of relativity, doesn't bother me. It's just a scientific rule. But I have to say that it's, as a matter of discipline and rigor, this is a very sloppy scientific rule, because it really does, it's just describing, it's just saying, well, let me give you an example. So there's a Lamborghini Diablo, great car, amazing car. And I tell you, well, I can say this, what I'm going to say now. There was a carton box. Right. And then eventually certain metallic molecules formed, but they formed step by step. At first the box was mostly carton, but little by little it became all metallic. And then there was a differentiation between the exterior of the car, which was metallic and had this amazing color, and the interior, which was leather and had a color that matched the exterior quite nicely, actually. Eventually, only those objects that were able to travel were able to survive, so 4 wheels developed. And quite logically, together with the 6.5-liter, 690 horsepower engine, fuel economy was also a factor, and the sleek exterior. I can say it. I just can't say it with a straight face, honestly. I mean, I'm not very impressed with the scientific theory of how life came about. I went to Columbia University. I once heard the biology teacher, and I was sitting there, and she said, like, in the laboratory, we can make a thing that looks like a cell. I mean, is that like science? Like, I can make a thing that looks like a phone. I mean, how is that, like, are we children? So I'm not saying this to be mean to scientists. I think science is great, and I think science has done incredible things. But here, I think science is just doing a disservice to humanity, because they're proposing this, it's not even a theory, it's a hypothesis. And it's a silly hypothesis. So what I would say as a scientist is, we don't understand how life came about. I like that answer. We don't understand scientifically how life came about. We have no scientific explanation. And the reason we have no scientific explanation is, well, I'll say it in a moment. But generally speaking, when you have random processes, random processes do not create more complex systems. When you have random processes, they always create less complex system and more disorder. It's just an empirical fact. So I think that whereas in my previous classes, I was amazed at science and I said, wow, science really contributed a lot to our understanding of the universe, and I said so. In this case, I think science is quite lacking, and it doesn't really explain anything, at least not scientifically. So I want to tell you what Judaism says about the development of life. And there's a key word here, and we'll see the word in a moment, okay? I'm sorry?
There's no creator in that whole thesis.
Well, no, that's fine. And they can say that, for example, they say, how did the universe came about? So they have the Big Bang Theory. I can live with that because the Big Bang Theory is a scientific explanation which actually has certain scientific principles that are demonstrable in the laboratory that we've observed and we understand them, and they can be conceptualized and explained mathematically and scientifically. The problem with the theory of evolution or this explanation of life is just it's not scientific. That's my point. My point is, at the scientific level, I find it to be lacking. So I'm going to give you soon what the Torah says about this subject. One moment. So first we said, Yishresu Hamayim. So life comes from the oceans, from the waters. On this science and the Torah agrees. Sheres Nefesh Chaya. We said that all Sherasim, all Sheres is something that moves, has a Nefesh, right? So birds, they breathe. Fish, they breathe. Animals, they breathe. Do all Sherasim breathe? Do all things that move breathe? Meaning, are they actually living organisms that do not require oxygen or do not breathe? You understand my question? Does anybody know the answer to that?
There are anaerobic bacteria, if you want to count those.
Well, let's say this. Yeast. Yeast cells. Yeast cells. They don't require oxygen. Actually, oxygen ruins it. I think that's why, when you, if I'm not mistaken, when you make wine, it needs to be somehow sealed up because if air gets in, it ruins the fermentation process, right? So yeast doesn't require oxygen. The only thing I would say about yeast is that it's not motile. It doesn't move. So it's not a sheres. Here we're talking about sheres nefesh. So it requires oxygen, but it moves. There is a certain type of jellyfish as well that they found that it's actually kind of a parasite, and this jellyfish does not have any mitochondrial genome, meaning it has no mitochondria, it doesn't require oxygen, it lives in the oceans, but it doesn't require oxygen. But also this jellyfish, it's non-motile, meaning it's not a sheres, it doesn't move. It goes according to the currents of the water, and wherever the currents of the water takes the jellyfish, that's where it is. So in terms of the relationship between something being mobile and something requiring oxygen, meaning it has a mitochondrial genome, or it has mitochondria in its cells and therefore requires oxygen to produce energy, there's a very interesting correlation between the two things, between the sheres and the nefesh. I want to point that out because, again, where science is correct, I acknowledge it, I like it, it works well. So that's the first point. So let's summarize where we're at, and then I want to get back to the question of creation. I remember I said, how does science explain creation of life? And I was dissatisfied with that explanation. Now I want to get to that in a moment. But first, let's summarize. So we have sheres, nefesh, chaya. These are the fish. God creates the fish, and the fish breathe oxygen. I wonder if in antiquity, whether in antiquity people realized that fish breathe. That's an interesting question. I didn't research that topic, but it would be interesting to research that topic. Meaning, did the ancients believe that fish required oxygen, or did they realize, well, you take it out of the water and now it has air, it dies. In the water, there is no air. Apparently, there is no air. There's actually oxygen molecules in the water, and it has the ability to extract the oxygen molecules from the water. But I wonder if the ancients knew this. That's an interesting question. Does anybody have the answer to that? No? Okay. Sarich Iyun. Let's leave it in Sarich Iyun, but I think we can find the answer if we do a little research. And the answer to that would be interesting because the Torah is very clear about this. There is no ambiguity as to the fact that the fish breathe. Nefesh chaya. Okay. All right. So, ve'of ye'ofef al ha'ares al penei hashamayim. So interesting. So God first creates the fish, and the fish, they glide through the water. And then he creates the birds, and the birds glide through the air. And visually, there appears to be some sort of connection. But I want to point out to you, scientifically, an amazing connection between birds and fish. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the fish and the birds were created on the same day, because there is something they both need to survive. There is a common denominator between fish and birds, and it's a particular mechanism that they have, which is unique to them. Does anybody know what it is? Navigation. There is a particular system of navigation that fish have, that birds have, and they're very similar. So to demonstrate this, I'm just going to read to you, again, a scientific article. This particular article was in Scientific American. I'm not reading the whole article, don't worry. I'm going to read, however, one paragraph from this article, and it reads as follows. It's trying to explain the navigational skills of fish, and we're going to be dealing with a specific kind of fish that actually has an incredible navigational skill, the salmon, that somehow they know how to return upriver to the place where they originally spawned. That's the scientific question, and here's what the article says. How salmon return to the correct shoreline region is not completely understood. But scientists say we don't fully understand that. And again, I wish they said that about the creation of life, because they really don't understand it scientifically. Nevertheless, it appears they use some form of map and compass navigation based on information about position and direction of travel, a GPS system. This information most likely comes from a suite of environmental cues, including day length, the sun's position, remember that, the polarization of light that results from its angle in the sky, the Earth's magnetic field, remember that, water salinity and temperature gradients. Whatever the specific mechanism, they don't know it fully, but they understand that the navigational skill is related partly to the sun, partly to the magnetic field of the earth, partly to its ability to sense objects around, and somehow the salmon makes it to where it needs to be. That's the sheres nefesh chaya, that the waters, sharesu, asher sharesu amayim, that's the fish. But the same pasuk says, ve'of yofef al ha'aretz. And what's interesting is that it's right there in the same pasuk. So let's see what it says about the birds. How do the birds navigate? And same exact start of, this is a different article, a different scientific journal. I don't remember where this one comes from. It wasn't Scientific American. And look how it starts. It says exactly the same thing. Scientists are not entirely sure how birds navigate. Okay? They seem to have an internal global positioning system, GPS, that allows them to follow the same patterns every year. And I'm just skipping over to the amazing thing. What is it that the bird uses to figure out its location? It uses the sun, it uses the stars, it uses a positioning, and it uses the Earth's magnetic field, which is stronger at the poles and weaker at the equator. So here you see that there is a profound connection between ofef, the ability of the bird to fly through the sky, on the one hand, and the sheres nefesh chaya, the fish that are shoresim in the water, that have the ability to glide through the water. Right? So those fish glide through the water, the birds glide through the sky, and it's not just a visual connection. Visually it's nice, but at that particular mechanism that allows the bird to navigate is very similar to the mechanism that allows the fish to navigate. Hence, they are brought exactly in the same pasuk. Let's continue. So the question I said, how does the Torah explain life? Remember that? How does the Torah explain dead matter? that quantum jump to living matter, to life forms, right? So, Vayivra Elohim. What does the word Vayivra mean? So there was the idea, there was a concept, and now there is the implementation of the concept. The idea was, let there be these birds, let there be these fish. Now there's the implementation, and the implementation is done through the word Vayivra. What does the word Vayivra? Why is the word Vayivra used here? So, when the pasuk says Bereshit bara, what does bara mean? So I explained it in my second class on Bereshit. Bara literally means to cut off, right? To cut off. So what there was before is completely different than what there is after. There's a cut, there's a split. Nothing in the after state can be explained based upon the earlier state, right? Bara, right? So there's a complete separation. Bereshit bara Elohim. There is no explanation how, if there was an ayin, if there was nothingness, why is there now something, right? So that's bara. When it says Vayivra Elohim et hataninim hagedolim, do you know what that means? Something very profound. There is nothing in dead matter that can somehow explain life. Life is not a natural process that just happens. Life is a quantum jump. It's a new organization. It's not just a new organization, it's information. And when you talk about, for example, let's say I want to create a Boeing jet. So there are blueprints, right? And in order to create that jet, I need to follow the blueprints. Now, the blueprints of the jet are different, for example, than the blueprints of a MacBook Pro, which I'm using here to record the class, right? It's different blueprints, but there are blueprints. What's amazing about life is not just that there are these creatures that breathe and move and have cognition, right? But it's a quantum jump in information systems, because each life form itself is the product of a blueprint. And that blueprint is loaded with information. And therefore, the Torah is saying you can't look at inorganic matter and say, well, that inorganic matter would naturally lead to the development of life. No, you can't say that. You can say it, I guess, if you're not thinking about what you're saying, you can say anything. But I want to just give you one point, because I want to finish the idea that we studied before. So let's say, for example, let's take a simple life form. Let's take a fruit fly, okay? Let's take a fruit fly. Let's say I take the genetic code of a fruit fly, and the genetic code is based on these 4 letters sequences. So let's say I write down the entire genetic code of a fruit fly, and I think it's going to be millions of cards, right? Each card represents a different letter, and I sequence them properly. So now I have the blueprint for a fruit fly. Now the point of science, or the attempt of science, was to say, well, you have this simple organism will become a more complex organism through some random process. They call the random process natural selection, but they don't believe in God, so they believe it's a random process. So let me ask you a question. Imagine now I was to set the cards like end to end. It would be millions of cards, so there's no way for that simple fruit fly. And let's say a wind came in from the window and started blowing the cards around. So that's a random process. Raise your hand if you believe that the wind blowing the cards around will create a new, more sophisticated organism, a new, more sophisticated fly. Does anybody really believe that? Meaning, we're now going to take the new order of the cards and look at the cards and, wow, that fly can now talk. It couldn't talk before, but naturally it can talk because, the wind came in and blew the cards, and now we have the blueprints for a talking fly. Does anybody really believe that? Is anybody willing to raise their hand? I didn't think so. Right. So that's why the Torah says Vayivra. You see why the Torah says Vayivra? The Torah says this is not something that you can explain logically. The same way you can't explain yesh me'ayin, as the ayin somehow naturally has the yesh. It doesn't. It's 2 opposites. You can't explain dead matter turning into living matter. Vayivra. That's the key. And this is the second time, I believe, it's used, the word Vayivra appears, right? It's used with respect to Bereshit bara Elohim, bara, right there. And by the way, we say Yoser Oru Borei Choshech. There's a reason why you say Borei Choshech there, right? Does anybody know why it's Borei Choshech? But what did you say?
Separate the light, new thing.
Right, but why Borei Choshech? Don't forget, the Ruach Elohim, the Choshech, right? Right. There was darkness before there was light. Right? And then Vayomer Elohim Yehi Or. So at first there's Ayin, first there's nothing, and then there's a state of Tohu, Vavohu, Vechoshech al Pnei Tehom, and then Vayomer Elohim Yehi Or. So what's that? Because it's Borei Choshech. Why is it Borei Choshech? Because nothingness is not darkness, right? You know, people think, oh, it's nothing. If there's nothing, it'll be like being in a dark room. Actually, no. Dark room has darkness, right? There was no darkness in the ayin. You understand that, right? A room, like a room with no walls, just infinite space. Well, actually, no, there was no space in the ayin because space itself is a creation, right? So that's why we say borei choshech. We recognize that the choshech itself is inexplicable. Darkness is inexplicable from the ayin. You can't explain the yesh of darkness from the ayin, right? It's boreh choshech. You understand why it's boreh choshech? Once you have choshech, you can have or, so yotzer or, right? You can understand, you create opposites, okay. But choshech itself is infinitely different, bara, from the ayin, from the nothingness. Okay, so here we have Vayivra. So it's telling you, this is an incredible quantum jump, inexplicable. Don't try to figure it out, how life just came about spontaneously, because it didn't. You need Vayivra. Yeah.
Once light is created, don't you also have to create darkness so that the light does not shine continuously?
Right. I mean, first of all, the darkness was created first, but yeah, that's why Vayavdel Elohim, God separates between the darkness and the light. So he does that. But let's continue. So what does he create? Now look at the creation here. Vayivra Elohim et Taninim Agedolim, the great giant Taninim, and he created all of the creatures that inhabit the waters. And he created all of the birds. Let me read that pasuk again, pay attention. So what does he create? The Taninim Agedolim. That's number one. Follow with me. Number two, all the sea creatures. Everything. And number three, and all the flying birds and everything else, anything that flies. So how many things were created? Taninim, fish, and birds. Birds include also flying insects. Okay, so the question is, what are the Taninim Agedolim? So I'm going to give you the standard explanation. The standard explanation of Taninim Agedolim is the whales, right? That's a standard explanation, and there's nothing wrong with that. You can accept that. I personally don't think it's whales. I'll tell you why. The reason I don't think it's whales is for textual reasons and for conceptual reasons. Conceptually, I don't think there's anything so unique about the whale. It's an incredible creature, as many, many creatures are incredible. But why single it out? Number one. Number two, doesn't it say, that's one thing. That's the fish. Those are the creatures that live in the ocean. I get it that there's different types of creatures. There's mammals, there's insects, there's flying creatures, right? Okay. The third thing is there is the birds. So I don't think that whales textually make sense because that would already be included in Nefesh HaHaya HaRomeset Asher Sharisu Hamayim Leminahem. Again, if you want to explain it as whales, explain it. I'm going to give you an explanation that's a little different. You can accept it. You can reject it. I believe this is an allusion to the dinosaurs. Taninim, Gedolim, giant taninim. There was no Hebrew word for dinosaurs. Why was there no Hebrew word for dinosaurs? Well, because of course dinosaurs were only discovered about 200, 300 years ago, so nobody even knew about dinosaurs until they were discovered. And that's why the Torah refers to them as taninim gedolim, giant, creatures, right? But these giant creatures are not part of the nefesh chaya haromeset asher sharasu hamayim, because the dinosaurs were land animals. They weren't sea animals. I mean, most of them. There were also there were some. There were different types of huge dinosaurs that were in the ocean also, but not exclusively so. And also the birds. That's my explanation. That's my explanation of thing. But I want to say, even if you say no, it's not dinosaurs. We don't like that. I want to say, and it's an odd. I don't know why this happens. If for some reason, I remember when I was young, I used to go to the Natural History Museum, and I saw dinosaurs. And I remember once coming to class, and my teacher, my Chumash teacher, a very nice person. I don't think he's Nishmato Eden, I'll say about him. So the rabbi told me, no, there's no such thing as dinosaurs. It's a lie. So I said, but I was just in the museum. I saw the bones there. He says, no, it's a fabrication. So I was young, and I knew the teacher. I didn't agree with what he said, but it struck me as odd. Why is it so important to say that these archaeological discoveries are not true, right? But he made it sound as if, although the Torah somehow contradicts that. And what was the premise? The premise was that the Torah doesn't mention the dinosaurs. If the Torah doesn't mention the dinosaurs, well, then, if there's dinosaurs, that means that's a contradiction to the Torah. And they do this all the time. And I just think it's wrong. Again, even if you don't think tadinim is dinosaurs, you don't have to accept that. I think that methodology is wrong. But the Torah doesn't mention mosquitoes. The Torah doesn't mention gorillas. The Torah doesn't mention many, many things. It doesn't mention the elephant. There's so many different life forms the Torah doesn't mention. It doesn't mention bacteria. It doesn't mention yeast. So none of these are contradictory to the Torah. The Torah is not a book on zoology or botany. It doesn't, it doesn't purport to be a list of every single life form that was ever created. It's a book. What we're reading is a description of God's creation of the universe, Maaseh Bereshit, and it's not a book on zoology. So that's really important. So whether you accept that Taninim Gedolim are dinosaurs or you don't accept, it's fine either way, but there is no contradiction to the Torah, to the manifestation, or the discovery, the discovery of different creatures over the course of human history. Let us continue. All right. So here's the thing, and why, according to my explanation, why would the dinosaurs be brought here on this fifth day? Just again, I'm gonna try to advocate against myself. Wouldn't it have been better to bring it on the sixth day? Right? Isn't that a better place to put it? Why put it here? Taninim again. Why put dinosaurs here? The dinosaurs are land creatures. I mean, okay, so one possible answer is dinosaurs are land creatures, but they also have ocean dinosaurs. Okay, fine.
Scientifically speaking, they say they start as ocean. Scientifically speaking.
Right. That's true. That's true. Yeah. Yes, young man.
Was it Adam and Hava were created on the sixth day?
Yeah.
And then they say that human life was only able to come because the dinosaurs were dominating the world before them. So once they went extinct, that was the next.
I agree with what you just said, and I'm actually going to repeat it in a moment. First of all, before I even get there, when we grew up, so we had a certain image of what dinosaurs look like. So, I used to buy books on astronomy and also on dinosaurs, and I used to see the pictures, and I knew what they looked like, and it's very enjoyable for me because I like science a lot. But now, those pictures or those images that I had in my mind are actually not accurate. Do you know what dinosaurs have? Like the latest scientific discovery of dinosaurs? Yeah. Let me read to you how dinosaurs evolved into birds. Again, I think this is Scientific American, another article from Scientific American. Here goes, part of the article. It is an unlikely relationship, but the humble pigeon is a descendant of the group of dinosaurs that also includes the mighty T-Rex, Tyrannosaurus rex. The two species have a remarkable biological past. Professor Paul Barrett explains how new understanding of dinosaur evolution is transforming the way scientists think. And then the article goes on, and you can probably find a lot of articles on this, and it says that actually dinosaurs were related to the birds, and many dinosaurs had feathers. And there's a strong relationship between dinosaurs and birds. So it's very interesting. I just think it's really fascinating how the Torah puts these three things together. Tananim Gedolim, which I believe are dinosaurs, Nefesh Hayat Umeset, which is the ocean, and the oath, because the connecting thing is dinosaurs, where there were dinosaurs in the ocean, then the dinosaurs are on the land, and there were dinosaurs in the, birds in the sky. But you see the scientific relationship between these creatures is actually very compelling. So I don't think it's a coincidence. And then to answer that question, as a young man over there answered, what's your name?
Daniel Adels.
Nice to meet you, Daniel. So because each day is a different stage in creation. Now, in order for man and other types of mammals to inhabit the world, it was necessary for God to send that asteroid, which destroyed the dinosaurs, and that stage was separate from the stage that we're going to be reading, well, I don't know if we're going to get to it tonight, but from the sixth day of creation. So you have the previous stage where you had the dinosaurs, you had different types of birds, you had different types of sea creatures, and then you have the next stage, which was completely different. It was a new day. It was Yom HaShishi. Yom HaShishi is the day that man is created and the other mammals are created.
Well, they actually found the link between dinosaurs and birds through like the ancient fossils, like Archaeopteryx. Like they actually found
The link between?
that direct link between like dinosaurs and birds. Like that was like the first ever like fossil they discovered with wings, and like they actually found that it flew, and it was like that was I don't know. I just thought that was like correlated with what you said with dinosaurs and birds, and the fact that
It's quite interesting, and in fact, people always thought that dinosaurs were reptilian, which are cold-blooded, when I grew up. But actually, that's not the case. Dinosaurs were warm-blooded and had a high metabolism, and they were similar to birds, and it's interesting that they did find that link. So let me ask one last question. Every day, and this fits very nicely with what Daniel said, and actually what I was thinking. So I'm going to ask a question. If you look at the previous days, for example, after he creates the vegetation, for example, day number 3, it says Vayichen, right? Here, and also on the 4th day, it says Vayichen, after he creates the celestial objects. It says Vayichen, right? Here, it doesn't say Vayichen. Why do you think that is? I think we answer the question, no? Because the 5th day of creation represents an early stage of creatures that inhabited, living life forms that inhabited the earth. Can we say Vayichen? We know as a fact that an asteroid came and destroyed these creatures. That's why it doesn't say Vayichen. Right? You see that? There's no Vayichen because this ended. Right? In Yom HaShishi, by the way, it says Vayichen. Till now, no asteroid came to destroy us. I'm rather thankful for that. Vayichen, right? But the other ones, no, they were destroyed. So you see how the Torah is, it's pretty accurate. I got to say, it's very impressive. Again, I'm not looking for vindication in science. I don't need science to vindicate my existence. Science has changed a lot, but there is some data that we know about, and it's really pretty amazing how dinosaurs and all those early life forms, we know they existed. That's just empirical fact. We know there was an asteroid that came, and we know that creatures no longer exist. Doesn't say Vayichen. But our stage of existence, Vayichen, and so it was. Okay, so let me just end by saying the following. I'll take questions in a moment. And by the way, there's a certain parallelism between the first 3 days and the last 3 days of creation. On the first day of creation, you have the light. On the 4th day of creation, you have the celestial luminaries, right? On the 2nd day of creation, you have the water and the air, right? The rakia, the mayim. On the 5th day, you have the creatures of the air and the creatures of the water, right? On the 3rd day of creation, you have the land masses, right? The the continents, you have different types of vegetation, the land masses, and on the sixth day, which is what we're going to be doing next week, you have the creatures that inhabit those land masses. So you see how really there's a beautiful parallelism. I wanted to point that out. And before ending, I want to ask a question, and then I'll take some questions if there are any in the audience. But if you look at the sixth day, you have many, many animals created on the sixth day, all the mammals, all the different life forms, minus those that were created earlier. And you also have man. So one of the great Hachamim, Don Yitzhak Abarbanel, asks the following question. The question is, why is man created on the same day as all of the other mammals? Right? Don Yitzhak Abarbanel, it's his question. For those of you who know a little about him, he had an amazing history. I think he was one of the wealthiest Jews that ever lived. If I'm not mistaken, he owned like a third of Portugal. He was the finance minister for the king of Portugal. And then eventually there's an expulsion of Jews. He ends up going to Castilla in Spain. He becomes, I think also there, he becomes a finance minister. And then there's the expulsion of Jews from there. By the way, if you read his Hakdama to the book of, to the Nevi'im Rishonim, he writes in his Hakdama, I don't know at which stage exactly in his life it was, but he's saying, thank God they kicked me out of wherever they kicked me out. I lost all my money, and I'm sitting here in a synagogue, and I finally had the time to to sit down and write this perush on Yehoshua, right? Like so. Anyway, so he went from Portugal to Castilla, then he ends up in Naples, then he ends up in Corfu. Eventually, he ends up in Venice. I think he dies in Venice, if I'm not mistaken. I think he was also one of the founders of the Republic of Venice, which is pretty amazing. So he was an incredible Chacham, but also an amazingly successful individual by all standards. So he says, what's the reason? Why is man, why doesn't God give a special day of creation for man? And if I had to summarize his answer, it would be, that's exactly the point. Because fundamentally, man can act like an animal. Fundamentally, man can turn his back on wisdom, man can turn his back on what's good, and can just decide to become evil. And when man becomes evil, he is like an animal. The Pasuk says, Umotar ha'adam min ha'behema ayin. What really is the difference between man and animal? Well, at the biological level, nothing. If you abstract man from the wisdom that God gives us, then yeah, there we are. And that's why the Torah puts man in the same place as the creation of the animal. That's Don Yitzhak Abarbanel. So I thought I would share that with you. If there are any questions, we'll take the questions. After that, we will sell the Alvit. And if I'm not mistaken, I think we have some pizza there. Do we have pizza? Yes. So we also have pizza. So, usually we have the class in there, but we couldn't have the class in there for obvious reasons today. So, let's, any questions? Yes, sir.
People that say Tendinin or whales,
Leviathan, right. They say it's Leviathan.
but in all of Mekra, it's like what happened with it's a reptile.
Yeah, I know, exactly. And as I pointed out, there would be no Hebrew word to say dinosaur. So tanin also means a mythological creature, right? A monstrous mythological creature. It has that connotation. I think Rabbeinu Saadia Gaon points that out as well in his Perush and Shemot. So right, so that's part of the limitation of language. So how does the Torah describe things? So if you've been following the other classes, oftentimes we have that question, how do you describe matter, antimatter, separation of the two? And I kind of went into some of that as well in the previous classes. Yes, sir.
I'd like to piggyback on that.
Please.
The point of the word dinosaur, they had to come up with that when they discovered dinosaurs. So I think it just means terrible lizard in Latin.
Right.
So it's, okay, so big reptile, terrible lizard. Okay.
Right.
Come up with a couple of words that express what it is.
Right. Nice. Yeah. Good. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I think there's also a concept that the Torah uses the language of man in that time. So, for example, it says, I don't think anyone thinks the world has four corners.
Yeah.
But also when the world that Ibn Amin has, it's relative to its time period. So it's not going to use like a word that's not, understandable to man. It's not understandable.
Yes and no. First of all, you're right. Dibirat Torah K'lshon Bnei Adam. Correct. The Ishmael says Dibirat Torah K'lshon Bnei Adam. And we believe that, we accept that. Just as to the last point, and when the Nevi'im talk, they use ideas that are prevalent among man. All that is correct, and this is one of my father's great chidushim, and it's a thing that my father told me at some point, and it's really opened up my eyes, and it's enabled me to navigate through different things. And what he told me is that in the case of Nevi'im, that's correct. Nevi'im and Ketuvim, you have that, so there's a lot of ideas that are prevalent, and the Navi would use the prevalent ideas to express what it is that he wants to express. Whether the prevalent idea is an accurate one or not, what's important is the nimshal, not the mashal. In the case of the Chumash, that doesn't happen. In Torah Moshe Rabbeinu, because Moshe Rabbeinu received the Torah Pe'el Pe'el Berbo directly from God, everything is absolutely precise. And by the way, I think when you read these Pesukim, you see a certain precision, a scientific precision. So I think it's all there. Yeah. Any other questions before we pray out of it? Yes, Bernie.
So it's not just the separation between reptilian, mammalian, there's a whole mixture
Right.
in the creation.
Right.
It's not one stage, you went from reptile to mammal to...
Right. Right. Correct. Vayivra, Vayivra. That's why you're also going to see the word Vayivra later on the sixth day. Mikey, you agree that maybe we should pray out beat and then, right. רבי חנניה בן הקשיא אומר, עשה הקדוש ברוך הוא לזכות את ישראל, לפיכך הרבה להם תורה ומצוות, שנאמר, אדוני